All right. So welcome and thank you everyone who decided to join today's webinar. My name is Dr. Sofia Wenzler. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and also the clinical lead here at TrichStop. TrichStop is the online therapist-assisted treatment program that can help you reduce your hair pulling. And today we're going to talk about the connection between personality traits and hair pulling. Okay, wait, I see a question in the Q&A section. Let me just check if that's something about. Yeah, this webinar is going to be available on our YouTube channel, trichstop.com. So you can watch all past webinars on our YouTube channel. Yeah, that's already a good start. So someone wrote something in the Q&A section. We're going to talk about personality traits and hair pulling. During the rest of the presentation, that's going to be about 40 minutes long. I'm not going to check the Q&A section again. I just did that now because I thought maybe someone's telling me that they can't hear you or hear me or something like that. But please feel free to write down all your questions in the Q&A section already now, or do it at the end of the 40-minute presentation, because then we're going to move on to a 20-minute Q&A where you can ask any and all questions that come to mind. I just want to ask you to write down the questions in the Q&A section and not raise your hand or something like that. I'm going to go through the questions that are written in the Q&A section. Okay, I think that's it. Let's just dive into it. So we have a pretty... So please, like, I see someone is raising their hands. Please write down the questions in the Q&A section, because I'm not going to react to raised hands. So we have a pretty classical structure for the webinar today. We're going to talk about what personality means, where it comes from, and then we're going to do a quick practical part where we do a very short live personality test, so you can check where you stand in terms of one of the most popular personality theories, the Big Five personality theory. Then we're going to talk about how personality and mental health are connected, and then in more detail about how personality and hair pulling are connected. Then we're going to conclude what we learned, and as I said, move on to the Q&A section. So obviously, all of you guys have some kind of concept of what personality is, but it is really difficult to put in words, and there is a lot of misconceptions and things like personality disorders are completely overused in common language. So I do want to start with on common ground with a short definition. I found this one here very, very helpful. It's by Professor Carol Dweck. Personality is about how and why people differ from each other in their characteristic modes of thinking, feeling, and acting. So basically, our personality describes how we react differently to specific situations. We all have specific patterns of how we react to internal or external situations, which means the automatic feelings, thoughts, and action tendencies that come up. And those are not the same for each and every one of us. So there we can describe different personalities. So it's basically just another way to compare people, to say this person is tidier than the other one, this person is more shy than the other one. Also, personality is relatively stable over time. It can change due to medical or neurological changes or drastic life events. I mean, if really critical things happen to us, for example, we go to a difficult divorce or we go through a traumatic event, then that can also affect our personality. And also, personality can change with age, specifically until we're adults. So until the age of 18, which is obviously a random, like, I mean, not that at age 18, we're all adults, but technically we say that until we're 18 years old, our personality is still being shaped and it's not stable yet. So we also don't diagnose personality disorders in children or teenagers because we always assume that things can still change. After that, it's pretty stable. Okay, so as I said, personality is actually just another way to describe a person. You can describe a person in terms of like how tall they are, which hair color they have, and you can put people in boxes or characterize them based on their character. It's just more complicated, but I'm not going to explain to you how it works. Anyways, so then you have different categories of people. And why do we do that? Why would we put people in boxes? Because then we can draw assumptions based on, defining their character. We can say, if, you look at this graph and say, okay, there's character trait orange, green, brown, and yellow, then you can say, okay, the people with character trait brown have a higher likelihood to be women than the people with character trait yellow, or the people with character trait brown are rarer than the people with character trait green. And you can say the people with character trait orange have a higher likelihood to suffer from hair pulling. So it just helps us to understand connections between different features in people better. I'm not going to bore you anymore with definitions. Let's think about where it comes from. Why are we even different in our personality? And as with many other questions as well, there's only two options, nature or nurture. Either we're born with it or it's formed and shaped through our life experiences. And obviously, spoiler, it's a mix of both. And I'm going to explain to you what we know about which parts are more significant. But it's also an interesting question that I haven't answered in the webinar so far. How do we even know? Like, if I look at myself and think, okay, I am the way I am, Sofia, with all my personality traits, how would I know, which of those parts are nature and which are nurture? I couldn't. But in research, we have such a thing as twin studies. Why are twin studies interesting? Because specifically identical twins share 100% of their DNA. So if we put two identical twins in different environments, as has been done in a very popular research study, then we can say every difference we find between those two twins is based on environment, because it cannot be based on genes because they share 100% of the genes. Now, obviously, this is a very problematic thing to do, to separate twins at birth and put them in two different houses. And a research study like this would never, pass any ethical committee ever again. But it did happen from 1979 to 1999. And what resulted was the Minnesota twin study of twins reared apart. And there, psychologist Thomas Bouchard and colleagues looked at many, many different traits or characteristics and compared them between the twins. I mean, it was a big group. It was not one, set of twins, a big group of sets of twins. So they could actually draw statistical conclusions, and they checked all kinds of things. For example, they also checked IQ, and they found that there's a variance or difference in IQ between twins of 30%. So if we say all the differences are based on environment because the DNA is 100% identical, then we can see, okay, if 30% are different and based on environment, then 70% are similar and based on DNA. So we know IQ, at least based on this study, is 70% nature and 30% nurture. And they did the same for personality. It's arranged for personality because there's different personality traits, but roughly they said 15 to 55% of the variance in our personality is due to genetic factors. As I go on in this webinar, I'm just gonna take the average. I'm not gonna say 15 to 55% every time. I'm gonna just talk about 35% genetic influence on our personality. So actually, the greater part of our personality is based on our life experiences. When we talk about nature in terms of personality, we call that temperament. So this part we are actually born with. Just like, some parents say, wow, my children, they had their personality from the moment they were born. Now we know it's not completely true. It's only 35% of the character, but we can see, significant differences in how babies react to the world. And those differences can be characterized on 9 scales. You have activity level. Some babies are just more active and constantly moving, while others are more relaxed and still. Adaptability. So some babies can handle changes really well, and some become irritated when routines are disrupted. Their babies are different in whether they approach the world with curiosity or caution, in their distractibility, which means ability to focus without shifting the focus, in the intensity with which they express or experience, I guess, emotional reactions, mood. Some babies are just happy most of the time, and some are more irritated. The persistence with which they can focus their interest on one thing, regularity of biological patterns, and how reactive they are to outside stimuli, for example, how easily they are woken up from a nap and things like that. So all of those things you can pretty much, catch up on from the moment a baby is born. And then that baby, with its 35% genetic temperament, meets the world. And the world includes a lot of different things. So the house in this graph represents the parents, of course, the parenting style, the parents' temperament, whether there are siblings, the culture a child grows up in, the language they learn, the socioeconomical status, the social interactions they have, and all the life events, basically, that they go through. For example, whether the parents divorce at some point or stick together. A lot of different factors. And that, 35% temperament and 65% of all the things that they experience until they're 18, more or less, form the personality of a grown person. I do want to give you one example of, an environmental factor that has a really strong influence on personality, and also a very interesting concept, which is attachment. So some of you might have heard about the fact that there are different attachment styles that we can have. Attachment means the emotional bond that forms in the early years of life, usually between a child and their primary caregiver or givers. And feeling attached is kind of this feeling of being connected, of knowing that I'm safe and that I'm taken care of. And there's a very, very, very important and popular psychological theory about attachment, the attachment theory by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, which says that based on my early attachment experiences with my primary caregivers, I can form different attachment styles, and those styles will later have a huge influence on my personality and on my ability to have an intimate, stable relationship with a partner. So there's tons of research on attachment theory, and there's many, many therapeutical approaches that take this theory into account. And also recently, there's been a lot of, I don't even know how to call this, but like when psychology kind of enters social media and the conversation, and then it's really good because we talk about it, but it's also bad because there's misconceptions and misunderstandings. So you can take many, attachment style tests now online. I don't know how valid they all are, but like a lot of people have heard about it or some kind of idea what their attachment style is. yeah, so I want to just give you 3 examples of how a baby with its 35% of genetic temperament might, perceive their parents and their connection to them, and which attachment styles would result from this. So let's look at baby number 1. Let's pretend the baby can talk. To interact with my mother, I smile and gurgle at her. She smiles and gurgles back, and it feels good. When I'm upset, she comes over and comforts me. I conclude that I can engage her. She accepts me. People are responsive to me, and the world seems to be a good, safe place. So that obviously is a baby that has the opportunity to form a secure attachment to their caregiver, and then they draw assumptions, because when the babies and children also kind of assume that the whole world is exactly the same as the environment that they grow up. Like the way it is in my house, that's how the world works. If I can trust my parents, then I'm going to be trusting. I'm going to have a trusting attitude towards the rest of the world, more or less. Obviously not that black and white, but generally that's the idea. And so people with a secure attachment are likely to be able to trust, to be resilient, and generally self-confident. Those would be the personality traits that result from a secure attachment style. And 50 to 65% of children have a secure attachment. So most of them, fortunately. Let's look at baby number 2. When I was scared, I looked to my mother. She was displeased, and I felt frustrated and still scared. The next time I was distressed, I tried it again, and the same thing happened. However, when I want to play, she is pleased and happy to play. I conclude that my mother does not like it when I am needy, that I could engage her only when I feel happy, that people will only love and accept you if you are happy. I also want to say that in this example, it's always the mother, but obviously a caregiver, it doesn't have to be a mother. It's just a mother still in most of the cases. So what you see here is a really early version of rejection, at least the rejection of some part of the baby. So that baby or later on child will learn that they can't always rely on others, and that they have to be a certain version of themselves to be accepted. So adults with that kind of anxious attachment, this is called anxious avoidant attachment, will not show weakness or negative emotions, or will try to avoid to show weakness and negative emotions in front of others. They might prioritize self-sufficiency over attachment and vulnerability, and they might have problems maintaining or trusting an intimate relationship, because if you don't share your vulnerable parts, then there's always kind of like a wall or some distance in the relationship. And 15% of people, around 15%, have an anxious avoidant attachment style. Baby 3. Sometimes when I cry, my mother comes and comforts me, and sometimes she gets annoyed. Sometimes when I want to play, she is happy to play, and sometimes she turns away irritated. I never know when I will get one reaction and when I'll get the other. People are unpredictable, and my control over them is limited. This leaves me feeling anxious. What if I really need something and no one is there for me? That would be the second example of an anxious attachment style. This attachment style is called anxious preoccupied or anxious ambivalent. Again, 15% of adults. And it's kind of that the baby gets an intermittent reinforcement, almost like when you gamble. So they show the same behavior, and sometimes they get lucky and sometimes they don't. And that creates a constant craving for love, approval, and acceptance, while simultaneously never feeling secure or feeling sure that that's what I'm going to get. So always fearing to be disappointed. And as adults, you have a higher likelihood to have low self-esteem, strong fear of rejection or abandonment, and also behaviors of clinginess and relationships. So yeah, I think attachment is a really good example of how our environment can have a strong influence on our personality, in addition to the 35% DNA. 35%, I'm saying this as if it's math. It's more vague, but let's say 35. And that's how our parents can shape our personality. But let's not forget that the baby's temperament, it's from the beginning, it's an interaction between my temperament and my surrounding. If I'm a super easygoing, happy, baby that almost never gets irritated, it's going to be easier for my caregivers to, demonstrate the behavior that will lead to a secure attachment. If I'm a very irritable baby that has really strong emotions and that is very difficult and crying a lot of the time, then my caregivers have a higher, risk of sometimes just losing it or being distant or yelling at me. So it's obviously it's not the baby's fault, but it is an interaction. It's not, a path that goes only in one direction. Okay, I think we talked enough about where personality comes from. We have a clear idea of what it is. Let's do a quick personality test. So what we're going to do, we're going to go through five dimensions. For each dimension, I'm going to ask you two questions. Here is an example for the first dimension, and it would be really helpful if you take your phone or piece of paper and a pen if you're old school, and write your results down. So here we would note the letter. I know it looks like a circle, but it's actually a letter. It's a O. And then your result is the added up score that you get when you answer the question. So how well do the following statements describe your personality? I see myself as someone who has few artistic interests. Now you can choose. Disagree strongly, that would be a 5. Disagree strongly would be a 5. Agree strongly would be a 1. Everything else is in the middle. And the second one would be, I see myself as someone who has an active imagination. Now, let's say you answered, I see myself as someone who has few artistic interests, agree a little. And then I see myself as someone who has an active imagination, disagree a little. Then your thumb score for O would be 4. And that's what I would want you to write down. I'm going to shut up for a few seconds to let you answer the question. Okay. Move on to the next one. C. I see myself as someone who tends to be lazy. I see myself as someone who does a thorough job. And pay attention to the numbers because as you see, the order is always inversed. It's always 5 to 1 for one question and 1 to 5 for the other. Now we have E. I see myself as someone who is reserved. I see myself as someone who is outgoing, sociable. A. I see myself as someone who is generally trusting. I see myself as someone who tends to find fault with others. And the final one, N. I see myself as someone who is relaxed and handles stress well. I see myself as someone who gets nervous easily. Okay, so at this point, we have 5 personality dimensions: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And for each one of them, you should have a score. If the score is between 2 to 4, then that would be low. 5 to 7 would be medium, and 8 to 10 would be high. So you can see in which character traits you have high scores, medium scores, and low scores. And I want you to keep that in mind as we move on, and as I explain to you a little bit about this personality theory. So this is called the Big Five personality theory. There are many, many personality theories out there. You can take tons of personality tests if you Google them, but this one is one, or maybe the one, that has the best scientific base. And specifically also, if someone, a researcher, wants to check any connection between personality and something else, then they use this personality test. So there's just the most research based on this personality theory. Yeah, so it's well researched. It has been shown to be consistent across cultures and stable over time. And there's 5 dimensions. Openness, how open a person is to new ideas and experiences, inner or outer experiences. Conscientiousness, how goal-directed, persistent, and organized a person is. Extroversion, how much a person is energized by the outside world. Very important. It doesn't mean necessarily how much you like to be with other people. It's more, do you get energy from being with people, or does it take energy from you to be with people? Then you would be more introverted. Agreeableness, how much a person puts others' interests and needs ahead of their own. And neuroticism, how sensitive a person is to stress and negative emotional triggers. And just, I'm not going to go into the statistical background of this now, but this is not, a famous psychologist who just thought about those 5 dimensions and thought, oh, that makes sense. It's basically, if you would take all or a lot of questions, like 100 questions that you could ask a person to understand their character, if you would ask them, how much do you like to go to parties? How much do you enjoy conversations with strange people? Would you be able to ask someone you don't know what time it is? Like a lot of those questions. And then they do a psychological analysis to see if some of those questions are connected. If, for example, if I know that person, if a person answers high in question A, would they also answer high in question B? Okay, those questions are connected. And then from that, we draw conclusions about general dimensions of personality, just to make it easier, because I cannot ask someone 100 questions every time. So we kind of generalize. If someone is sociable, energetic, and talkative, then they would score high on extroversion, and so on. And then we get that those are very, very complex statistical analyses that led us to those 5 dimensions. That's all I'm trying to say. Okay, so now that we have a general idea of those 5 personality dimensions, we're going to learn more about them as we go. I know I just introduced them. And as you keep in mind where you stand in terms of those personality traits, let's look at personality and mental health. And when we, look at personality and mental health, it's basically, why do we do it? Because we ask ourselves, why do some people collapse under life stresses while others remain unscathed by severely traumatic circumstances? We ask about personality because we want to understand why some people, have a higher tendency to get depressed than others, or anxious, or develop PTSD after going through a traumatic event. Because some people experience traumatic events and have, develop post-traumatic stress disorder afterwards, and some don't. And personality is one reason why people react differently to stressful events or to what happens in their lives. It's not the only one, right? Personality is not the only factor that leads to mental health or illness, but it's one of them. So let's go through all of those 5 personality traits and see how they relate to mental health or illness. So openness, which means people who are high in openness are imaginative, creative, original, and curious, actually have a higher risk of suffering from depression. That might be because their openness, which is generally can be seen as a positive feature, means also being very open and receptive towards my own feelings and emotions, and consequently being very open, sensitive towards and receptive of negative emotions. That would be one idea of how to explain that. Conscientiousness, meaning people who are generally hardworking, well-organized, and punctual, is connected to confidence and social functioning. So actually more of a protective factor if it comes to mental health. The same goes for extroversion. People who are extroverted are joiners, talkative, active, and affectionate, and those tend to suffer from anxiety less and tend to experience more positive mood and enjoyment. People who are high in agreeableness, which means people who are trusting, lenient, soft-hearted, good-natured, people who may have a tendency to put others' needs in front of their own, also score higher in social functioning, positive mood, and enjoyment. And people who are neurotic, means people who are more worried, temperamental, self-conscious, and emotional, they score most of the problems. Social dysfunction, negative mood, loss of enjoyment, depression, anxiety, loss of confidence. I want you, before we jump, so obviously now we're going to talk more about what neuroticism means, because it has people who score high in neuroticism have the highest chance for mental problems with their mental health. I do want to remind you that scoring high in neuroticism does not define your whole personality. I mean, there are 5 dimensions to it, but generally, people who score higher in neuroticism have a higher risk of suffering from mental health problems. So the subscales of neuroticism would include emotional instability, the tendency to have mood swings, to feel more sadness, anxiety, and irritability, stress reactivity, to respond poorly to environmental stress and maybe even interpret ordinary situations as threatening, self-consciousness. So that means that people who score high in neuroticism are very self-aware and might worry a lot about how others perceive them. Vulnerability, they may feel more vulnerable to life's challenges, and impulsiveness, the tendency to act on impulse, specifically in emotional situations. So sometimes when I read, the subscales or the definition of neuroticism, I'm like, okay, well, that in itself already sounds, pathological, but it doesn't have to. I see a lot of positive aspects here as well. Being self-aware also makes you more reflective. You might reflect your actions more and anticipate consequences better. You might, because you are able to anticipate consequences, and because you are self-aware and want to, look good in other people's eyes, you might be more respecting of social rules. You might be more sensitive, better at understanding your own emotions or other people's emotions. You might, seek safety more, because sometimes people who score high in neuroticism feel easily threatened and perceive maybe minor incidents as more stressful. They also, seek safety more and try to, do everything to stay safe and calm themselves down. And lastly, people who score high on neuroticism are more attuned to their body, there's actually research on the fact that they are engaged in healthy care behaviors more, and that consequently leads to people who score high in neuroticism detecting cancer earlier. So basically, you could also look at it as a life-saving, personality trait if you want to. Just saying, everything has two sides. Now we're going to look more in depth into personality and hair pulling. I just want to disclaim at the beginning that the research I'm going to cite, because there's obviously less extensive research in the specific area of hair pulling, the research I'm going to cite is research based on BFRBs in general. So hair pulling, skin picking, nail biting, mixing them together because they're very similar. And that way I just have more research, to base things on. All right, so just like with general mental health, there is a strong connection between neuroticism and hair pulling. Neuroticism is a significant predictor of suffering from hair pulling and of hair pulling severity. And actually, every 1 point increase in neuroticism scores results in a 10% greater chance of a hair pulling diagnosis. So again, the biggest culprit is neuroticism, but I also quickly want to look at the other personality traits. So greater openness is also associated with greater hair pulling severity. One explanation for that would be that individuals that score high in openness are more aware of and immersed in their own feelings, therefore might be more likely to feel stress, which subsequently would trigger, the pulling severity. And also, if we look at people who suffer from hair pulling, there's generally lower agreeable scores, because maybe people who are score lower on agreeableness are also less worried about what other people think of them or of the traces of their hair pulling. And finally, introversion, which would be like a low score on the extroversion scale, was significantly associated with worse pulling severity, higher perceived stress, and higher depression. There was no connection between conscientiousness, no direct connection between conscientiousness and hair pulling. So what is the general picture that we can draw based on this research? You would say that if I want to, connect personality traits to hair pulling, that the classical, average, maybe very stereotypical person who suffers from hair pulling might show the following character traits. They might be more likely to be imaginative, creative, curious, and open to new ideas and experiences, may have a broad range of interest and enjoy intellectual pursuits, may tend to experience more negative emotions such as anxiety, worry, and insecurity, may be more sensitive to stress and prone to mood swings, more introverted and reserved, may prefer solitude or small groups over large gatherings and social events, and might not seek out social interactions as often as they may feel drained by prolonged social engagement. Yeah, that would be a very broad generalization of what we know about personality and hair pulling. If you scored high in neuroticism and feel discouraged now, which I could imagine one could be after learning those things, I do wanna go into one last point, or present you with one last thought. The thought, or the balance between acceptance versus change when it comes to personality. So again, personality is about how and why people differ from each other in their characteristic modes of thinking, feeling, and acting. So I know I said that personality is stable, and it is, but the fact that your personality is stable only means that your personality defines a certain pattern of your first and automatic reaction to things that happen to you. So your first intuitive thought, emotion, and action tendency when something happens to you is strongly influenced by your personality. However, the way you actually behave and what happens in your life is completely in your hand and not defined by your personality. So if you are a shy person and someone starts talking to you on the street, your first emotion might be anxiety. Your first thought might be, oh my God, this is super scary. What are they going to think about me? And your first action tendency might be to run away. I'm exaggerating. But if you are mindful and aware of this pattern, you can still, react in a self-confident, open way, even if you're shy in personality. For those of you specifically who scored high on neuroticism, if you feel easily stressed, if you interpret situations in a more threatening and negative way, if you experience intense emotions, as I tried to demonstrate before, I see that as an advantage and a disadvantage. Sometimes I explain it to my clients almost like, think of your personality or your inner experience as a wild horse. Okay, there may be people whose inner experience is much more calm and balanced, such as a domesticated horse. And for you to deal with what's going on inside, you might be much more difficult, just like you have to be a much more skilled rider to ride a wild horse than a domesticated calm horse. I hope nobody takes offense in this comparison. But there's also a lot of beauty, in the sensitivity, in the strong reactions, in the rich internal world that people have whose character is more like a wild horse. And it doesn't mean that you cannot learn, to deal with it, to cope with it, and to ride it. And maybe when you ride it, it's going to be even more interesting ride. That's what I want to end with. You are the one who shapes and defines who you are every day. Not your personality. Okay, so let's conclude. Our personality defines our initial and automatic modes of thinking, feeling, and acting in a certain situation. And where does it come from? It's a mix out of the temperament that we're born with and the environmental experiences that we make. And it's actually more your environment than the temperament. The most popular theory of personality is the Big Five personality theory: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. High neuroticism is generally the best predictor for almost all mental health disorders and also hair pulling disorder. However, while your personality might make you prone to develop unhealthy emotional regulation skills, just like hair pulling, you can still take control of your mental health and change patterns because it's in your hand. At the end of this webinar, I just quickly want to remind you that this webinar has been brought to you by TrickStop, the online therapy program that is therapist assisted. We offer monthly webinars. We have bi-monthly Q&A sections with one of our amazing therapists, Laura Sentner, who takes a whole hour in order to answer every and any question you might have about hair pulling. We have online forums and blogs on our website, trickstop.com. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And also, as many ask, this webinar is recorded and it's going to be uploaded to our TrickStop YouTube channel. All right, let's check the time. I went over time a little bit. We have 15 minutes left. So if you want to ask questions, you can now. Wow, that's a first. There's no question so far. Usually I don't even get to the end of the question. Is there, again, please write down your questions in the question section. Is there any cure? I'm suffering since my dad's death. So that's a general question. That general questions about hair pulling, you can also, I want to remind you that our Q&A sections with Laura Sandra are an excellent place to ask those questions. She's going to have more time to answer in depth. But I think cure is a very difficult term. There are evidence-based, effective therapeutic approaches for hair pulling. One of them is habit reversal training. That's a cognitive behavioral approach that has shown very good effectiveness. It's basically called the gold standard therapy treatment. For example, in our online therapy program, TrickStop, we use strategies of habit reversal training in combination with acceptance and commitment therapy, but obviously also, you know, specialists that you can see one-on-one that do habit reversal training can help you with your hair pulling. And yeah, so definitely there's things that can help you in specialized, you know, treatment plans. What's the best therapy to help with hair pulling? So that would be basically the same question. So based on research, the most effective strategy would be habit reversal training, a kind of CBT treatment. Habit reversal training in connection with acceptance and commitment therapy has also been shown to be effective. In terms of medication, we know less. There's no medication that's specifically been proven repeatedly to help, but there are promising medication types such as NAC. But usually I would recommend to try out therapy first or therapy in connection with medication. What benefit or relief does a child get from hair pulling? Good question. Wait, I want to click on the questions that I answered so I don't get lost. I don't think there's a big difference between the relief that a child gets from hair pulling in comparison to an adult. I think it feels different for every person. Some describe it as if you were, you know, scratching an itch or releasing a sneeze. Some people, I think, have more of like this relief in terms of having put something in order when you picked a certain hair or picked at your skin in a certain way when you had something that was, you know, bothering you. I just think the difference with children would be that probably they're much less aware of their patterns. You know, sometimes it's just like you know, children don't think about it much. They pick a hair and it kind of looks good or feels nice, or they start playing with their hair and then they just do it and they may not question it or may not know what's going on. But I think what they feel, if they would be aware of it and when they can actually talk about it, is very similar to what an adult would feel. Does changing your personality help with overcoming hair pulling? Well, I don't think you can change your personality. That's the point. You can only learn to deal with your personality and you can understand your patterns. You know, if you understand, for example, that you're a very introverted, shy person, and that, for example, that leads to when I'm just making this up on the spot, but like if you're like a very introverted shy person and you have a hair pulling disorder and that makes you very self-aware and might lead to you when you're out in the world thinking everyone ever only sees, you know, the spots on you, anything that would point towards the hair pulling, then you could, you know, not change your personality, but realize, okay, that's my personality. That's always going to be my first assumption and my first impulse and the first emotion that comes up. But it doesn't mean that it's true. that's, how my personality influences my worldview. So you could take that into account to then better understand your patterns and also better work on them. So I do think it's very important to understand your patterns, and part of your patterns are connected to your personality, but I don't assume, or based on research, we cannot really say that you can change your personality. Okay, how to help a child overcome hair pulling. You cannot, I mean, you're not a therapist. So you cannot really treat a child that has hair pulling. They need professional help. We actually have a program at TrickStop that specifically aims at parents, where the parent does the program at TrickStop, and through the program and through being guided by one of our expert therapists, you can learn to help your child stop pulling. But it's really hard to do that without the assistance of a therapist. In the best case scenario, you find a therapist for your child that also does parent counseling, and then you can go through the process together with your child. If you want to learn more about that, we also have webinars specifically on how hair pulling disorder looks like in children and what you can do. Also by our wonderful therapist, Laura Sentner, and you can find that webinar on our YouTube channel. I'm 62, not too sure I can change now. Easier said than done. Scored a 10 on neuroticism. It is always easier said than done, but it's never too late. Never, never, ever too late. 62 is not that old. You can always make changes. You might not, also, like, spoiler alert, the fact that there's an effective therapy for hair pulling doesn't mean that you just eliminate it. You don't cure it, but you learn to deal with it. You can reduce it, and there are people who can completely get rid of it. But even just reducing it by 50% is amazing and leads to a better quality of life. So if you're open to it, if you're open to really checking your patterns and working hard on monitoring yourself and learning competing responses, you can always make a change, even if you're at 10 on neuroticism. And as I said, there's also positive aspects in neuroticism. Hi, Sophia. Thanks for this information. Very interesting. I scored high, a 10 in every personality category except openness, which was a 4. Is there any correlation? So no, maybe some really low correlation, but the fact that those are different dimensions means that they don't correlate with each other. So that's very interesting. I mean, I would also maybe, you know what, it would be interesting. First of all, I mean, this is a very, very, very short version of the personality test. I only used 10 questions because everything else would have not, I wouldn't have been able to do that live with you in the webinar. But you can also look up the Big 5 and do an online personality test to check to recheck, to check if because it sounds like a really exceptional result. Where we test the same 5 dimensions, but not based on 10 questions, but based on like 40 or 50 questions. So I would do that again, see again if you score this high, and then maybe reflect on it with a person that's close to you that you would feel comfortable with, because like I don't want to question now the way you answered, but sometimes also when, for example, you're a person who experiences the world very intensely, maybe you have specific tendencies to just answer high in tests like that. There are people who just have a tendency to answer high in tests like that. Usually they answer, in extreme ways, either like always 5s or always 1s. For you, it would just be a lot of 5s. So I would go further with that. I would retake the test online with like a more comprehensive version, and then I would talk about it with other people. But generally, no, there's no connection. I mean, it does like there's no that's exactly the point that if you score high in extroversion, for example, that's no predictor in your scores for other dimensions. Do people with trick have recurrent depression stages, or is it that people with depression tendency have increased hair pulling, or is it both just interconnected? Very good question. I actually did 2 webinars on depression and hair pulling, or depression and BFRBs. BFRB is kind of like the category that hair pulling falls into, body focused repetitive behaviors. So it's a very intricate connection, and we cannot say with certainty whether the depression comes first or the hair pulling. So first of all, like feel free to go to our TrickStop YouTube channel and look at those 2 webinars that I did on depression. If you want to learn more about it. There's also there's a lot of interesting material in there. Obviously, I find it interesting because I chose it. There's, I think if I remember correctly, there's one research with adolescents that kind of vaguely points in the direction of hair pulling being there first and the hair pulling causing the depression, but that is really not significant or stable enough to draw like a conclusion that I would stand behind. Depression is a disorder that oftentimes comes second. Like just a lot of psychological disorders cause distress and problems, and that distress and those distress and problems then cause depression. So if, how do you call it, pushed against the wall, I would also always say depression second, but it can be either, and you definitely cannot draw any clear conclusion. I mean, you have to look at yourself and see how it works for yourself, I guess. All right. Well, that's amazing timing. There are no more questions, and it's exactly well, it's 9 p.m. for me. I don't know what time it is for you guys. So our hour is over. Thank you so much for those amazing questions and for participating. Please feel free to check out TrickStop or YouTube channel for an amazing library of different webinars on different topics. And I hope you have a great morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are.